Good afternoon or evening or morning, depending on where you are. My name is Kathy DeYoung, and I am a professor at Memorial University in Newfoundland and Labrador, and that's in Canada. So I wanted to walk you through what was originally my doctoral research. And I conducted that research in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, and essentially it was exploring the mental health service delivery experiences of 2S LGBTQIA plus identified youth. But before I go into the presentation itself, what I want to do is just share, I'm hoping to share a video with you. It's just a short video, just to sort of introduce the project. I'm not sure how or when stories became so important to me. I've always hated reading, although I like the idea of it, and I own a lot of books. I do like listening to stories, though, and I've intentionally done so for the majority of my life, as both a person and a professional. But the things that I hear in these stories aren't always said aloud. I hear these things in the timbre of someone's voice, in the look on their face as they tell their tale. I hear what is being said in my gut, where the dissonance between the words said and the content expressed takes root and inhabits me. It's not been easy being a receptacle for these things, a repository for the unsaid. This project finds its origins in these experiences. I've spent far too many years housing the unsaid, words devoid of their real meaning, implications devoid of their intended context, and lives devoid of authenticity, including my own. Perhaps this explains my fascination with the children's book, The Velveteen Rabbit, and with the process of becoming real, how I've been held captive by the desire in my own life to unearth the hidden, to chance acceptance, and to celebrate what was deemed ugly by those who lacked understanding. This project is a tribute to all of those who have been silenced for far too long, who have been rendered abject and other, and to those who have gone unrecognized and who have been made invisible by a system that lacks the ability to bring them fully into existence. In undertaking this project, I sought to open space for mental health stories to be told, for the experiences of LGBTQ2S+ youth to be recognized, and for suggestions to be shared that would make things better for future service users. I have not been disappointed. And so another chapter in my life closes, this time filled with stories that are worth reading. To Bobby, to Sean, to Caden, to Kevin, to Blair, to Enigma, to Dallin, to Ariel, to Jay, and to Martin, I thank you for speaking your truth, for sharing your wisdom, and for filling my life with hope for the future. And to my fellow sojourners and colleagues, those who have been entrusted as keepers of words, both said and unsaid, my deepest debt of gratitude is owed to you all. Okay, I'm not sure if you could actually have seen the video, but you certainly did hear the content of it. So, so that's a digital story that I developed to to share my perspective or my experience of the project itself. So let's, I'll walk you a little bit more through it then. So, the purpose of the project, initially, the primary purpose was to explore the influence of heteronormativity on mental health service provision. As the project evolved, the influence of other things, including cisnormativity, became central to the exploration as well. Specifically, the aim was to understand the impacts of these discourses, so heteronormativity and cisnormativity, on 2S LGBTQIA+ youth, service users, as well as on the service providers themselves. And the objectives of the study were threefold. The first was to conduct semi-structured narrative inquiry-based interviews with participants. The second was to help the participants create and produce digital stories of their own mental health service delivery experiences. And the third was to lead them in a digital storytelling circle where they shared stories with one another and received feedback. So the research question that drove this particular inquiry was, how does settler colonization heteronormativity and cisnormativity influence mental health service delivery, and what are their impacts on the experiences of 2S LGBTQIA plus youth and those who provide mental health services. As I said earlier, so the methodology was triangulated using narrative-based open-ended interviews, the creation and production of youth digital stories, and a culminating storytelling circle where participants shared their stories with one another. So there were 6 key theoretical frameworks that informed the study, but I'll just focus on 2 today because they're pertinent to this presentation. Excuse me. The first was queer theory. I think queer theory was central to the heteronormativity lens and to the discursive consequences such as homophobia and transphobia that was experienced by many of the participants. And the second relative theoretical framework is transgender theory. That was also central to the inquiry because it surfaced not only the impacts of the embedded cisnormativity in the mental health service delivery system itself, but also the particularly violent consequences for trans and gender nonconforming youth and service providers. Okay. Oops. Not sure why this isn't moving. Just one sec. I think my presentation's frozen. Okay, what? Just hold 1 second.
Yeah,
sorry.
Just because you didn't turn on your presentation view or slideshow, you can turn on the presentation view or slideshow. You know, yeah, click on there.
Yeah.
Slideshow.
Yeah, I have to stop sharing for a second to do that because it's blocking my toolbar. 1 sec.
Okay, no worries.
There. That should work now.
Okay.
Okay. So in terms of the participants, so I was able to recruit 10 2S LGBTQIA plus youth, 4 from the east side of the island and 6 from the west side of the island. So Newfoundland's quite a big island with about a 9-hour drive in between the 2 sides of it. 4 of the 10 participants self-identified as Indigenous. None were identified as Two-Spirit. Also of note was that I was unable to recruit participants from Labrador. So Labrador is a part of the mainland of Canada. And so it was due to geography and cost of travel. I was unable to have any participants from there. Of the youth who participated, 6 identified as transgender or gender nonconforming, and the other 4 identified as gay. Okay. So in terms of the findings, so 2 collections emerged from the findings. The first collection speaks to the background stories of the youth, what the things that brought them into service delivery. The second collection talks specifically to their service delivery experiences themselves. So in terms of the background stories, many of the youth participants experienced the presence of cis and heteronormativity early on in their lives. In fact, for some, it was as early as the age of 5 or 6. So Jay, for instance, who was one of the trans-identified participants, shared this. I knew that I was a guy when I was a really young kid, and I mentioned it to a lot until I was maybe age 10. And then I just gave up because I realized no one was respecting it. Further, the findings demonstrated that many of the youths interviewed were unable to fully embody their sexual or gender identification. For some, like Caden, this was due to internalized heteronormativity. So they'd inherited that from earlier life experiences. So Caden shared, in high school, I knew that I was trans, but I tried really hard to be the girliest of girls in my class. Like I even did beauty pageants to try to kind of fit in, which made me stand out even more. So other youth participants were also prevented from embodying their sexual or gender identification, but this time as a consequence of societal or familial enforced cis and heteronormativity. So Enigma, for example, who described the tremendous weight that they felt as a result of the enforcement of heteronormative societal and family ideals and expectations. They stated, I remember thinking to myself, you'll just have to live your life and just be a straight male. Find a woman to settle down with. You'll never, ever be able to come out to people. So heartbreakingly, when the youth were brave enough to stand up against cis and heteronormativity, they experienced the consequences of their choices. So as a result, many of the youth experienced institutional oppression and endorsed violence. So one of the youth named Blair shared this example. There was a trans woman that I knew that went to my school, and she just wanted to wear a dress to grad. And the principal called her down and was like, you can't wear a dress to grad. It's a safety concern. If you don't own a suit, then you can't come. Similarly, another participant who was a trans man wanted to wear a suit to his grad, and he shared that he said to the principal, "I'm going to wear a suit to grad," and what happened was, in turn, he got death threats. So he said he just gave up. It was the safest thing that he could do. And he also shared that the school didn't care anything about it and that they didn't do anything in response to the death threats that he'd received. Participants also reported the loss of personal relationships. So Martin, for instance, shared that because of being trans and a lack of acceptance of their gender identity, they lost a lot of family and friends. Bobby, a gay identified female participant, and Sean, a gay identified male participant, echoed Martin's experiences, each sharing their own story of being ostracized when friends found out about their respective sexual identities. Many experienced school-based bullying. So these stories varied in severity among the queer identified students or the participants. Sean identified an incident of microaggression when an unidentified peer left a ticket on his car windshield for being gay. The story amongst the trans and gender nonconforming participants was quite different, though. Blair, for instance, shared 2 specific instances of physical violence that were committed against him. So one occurred when he tried to access the washroom of choice, which in this case was the male washroom. And a second one involved death threats. He explained, I was being bullied really badly. People were threatening to kill me. They chased me down the hallway with baseball bats. So of no surprise is the fact that mental distress was a consequence of these experiences for the youth. What is surprising, though, is that the majority of the participants had internalized a biomedical understanding of their issues, which is understandable given the context and not having any sort of available discourses to help them make sense of it otherwise. But as a result of that, many of the youth were unable to make any connection between their mental health difficulties and the cumulative impacts of the distress that they had endured over time. Youth also identified a lack of affirmation by families as part of their mental health distress. So Ariel, for example, a female participant who identified as pansexual, made a poignant connection between an increase in her mental distress and her family's enforcement of heteronormativity. She shared that the first time she was ever suicidal was after she came out to her parents, who incidentally literally forbade her from being out in her home community. And that meant for her that she had to wait 1.5 years to be out until she went to university in a community that was a good 4 or 5 hours away from her home community. So collection 2 relate to the participants' experiences within the mental health service delivery service delivery system. And there are 5 themes that emerged and a number of sub-themes as well. So for the most part, the youths were not asked about their sexual or gender identity, causing their full identities to be invisible while in services. Caden spoke candidly about their experience sharing. I went there to an eating disorder clinic for their orientation. And on the application stuff, there was nothing ever asked about a preferred name or pronouns. So it was just assumed once again that I was cis female. They continued. So it was awkward for all of my intake appointments because they were going by the wrong name, because by this time I was using my preferred name. The youth overwhelmingly identified that most service providers lacked education and awareness of sexual and gender identity, making service delivery unsafe and at times violent. So, for example, Blair again shared this experience with a resident at his doctor's office when he was first seeking out trans-affirming medical and mental health care. So Blair explains, he, being the resident, kind of had a gist of what I meant when I explained that being trans was that I was born female, but I'm a guy now. And I think that was the basis of all he knew. It just seemed to be over his head. So the resident did a Google search using the word transgender and asked if I had this symptom or that symptom or another symptom. And then once he'd finished asking me those questions and I had replied yes, yes, and yes, he said, okay, implying that I'd met the criteria for transgender diagnoses. I'll go get the doctor for you now. The service providers also endorsed the stories shared by the youth participants. All spoke to inadequate knowledge and a need for education and training in areas related to sexuality and gender as the major contributor to the youth's negative service provision experience. So a service provider by the name of JP shared that providers often don't know how to answer youth and parental questions regarding sexuality and gender. And another service provider agreed and added that even the awkwardness associated with addressing issues related to sexual and gender diversity with clients and their families spoke to the embedded cis and heteronormativity that's in the curriculum that we're currently teaching in schools of social work. So this lack of safety and violence was disproportionately apparent in the stories shared by trans and gender nonconforming participants. The stories told uncovered instances of them being dead named and the purposeful use of incorrect pronouns. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the term dead names, it's essentially using the name that they were given at birth, and it's not their preferred or new name that they've taken. So Jay shared this experience with his campus-based service provider who purposely used his dead name and incorrect pronouns. When I first met them, I didn't have my name legally changed, and they wouldn't use my preferred name ever. And they would not use my preferred pronouns ever, especially if any third person had to be involved. They would still call me the wrong name, the wrong pronouns, all the time, being fully aware that that was not my name or pronouns. Participants were also purposefully misgendered. So Jay again shared that that the damage he felt as the consequence of intentional and blatant denial of his gender identity during his service provision. And that went far beyond the use of his dead name. Accordingly, he referenced instances when the mental health service provided outrightly challenged their gender identity and denied their self-knowledge about the same. And as a consequence for Jay, the provider refused to acknowledge their gender identity and continued to intentionally misgender them throughout the entirety of their service provision. So participants also experienced the erasure of their gender identities. Caden, for instance, described how the content of a treatment group at their eating disorders program caused their gender identity to become erased. Specifically, they expressed that the presentation of group content based on the gender binary was unhelpful. Further, they felt that these presentations held no treatment value for them or any other trans or gender nonconforming youth. Okay. Sorry, having issues with this. The youth also experienced judgment related to their gender identity. So Dallin, for instance, explained his hesitancy to use his local emergency department due to a fear of being judged by allied medical professionals. And he shared this. He said, like, even if it's not a mental health issue, if I'm not going into the emergency, I don't want to go into the emergency department because they're going to ask me what kind of medications I'm on. And I'll have to tell them that I'm on testosterone. And then I'll try to explain to them that I'm not using it to bulk up. But I always see this look of judgment that in their face, and I hear it in their voice. The youth also experienced the conflation of their mental health difficulties with their sexual and gender identities. And Martin, a newly identified trans man, shared his concern and fear in this way. I'm not sure even how they, a mental health service provider, would react if I were to say, well, I'm trans or I'm demisexual. And it makes me feel nervous to get help because they could be like, your depression is because you're trans, or your anxiety is because you're trans, but that's not how it works. So in conclusion, I want to note that this was just a high-level summary of my project. Many more and deeper themes emerged that haven't been shared today due to time constraints. Additionally, a host of service recommendations were made with the objective of making mental health service delivery safer and more inclusive for 2SLGBTQIA+ youth in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. So in closing, I want to share another digital story with you. And this is one that was produced by one of the youth who were involved with the project. And I can't think of any better way to end this presentation than to pay tribute to those who bravely and unselfishly shared their stories with me. Obviously, without their trust and participation, I would not have been able to complete this project.
Not everyone is lucky enough to have good mental health. Not everyone is lucky enough to have access to good mental health services. Even with access to some mental health services, I haven't been able to see anyone. I've told my doctor the thoughts I've had, but all he's done is prescribe me antidepressants. I've told him I want to kill myself, and all he's done is up my dose and let me be. I don't really get the chance to talk with him about my mental health. When I do, he keeps track of it, but doesn't do anything with what I tell him. When I've talked to my family, I learned that my brother had been referred to see a specialist. I don't understand why my brother would be referred when he and I have similar problems, but I have to teach myself how to cope. I learned from my brother about the walk-in clinics. My doctor never told me about it. I had been to see him for over a year, and he knew about my mental state, and he never said anything about it. It almost feels like my doctor isn't trying to help me. I want to go to the walk-in clinic. I don't want to come out and be told that my mental illnesses are my fault because of my identity. I fear having to come out to multiple people whom I don't know because I won't have a regular therapist. I fear being told that I could have prevented my anxiety and depression if I never chose to be a boy. My identity isn't the cause of my anxiety and depression. Being bullied for years caused my depression and anxiety. Close friends and family dying caused my depression and anxiety. My disease doesn't care that I'm trans. My story isn't over yet. It's still in process, and it might take a long time to reach its end. I don't fear my story ending. My fear is people not believing my story. But I guess that doesn't matter, because it's my story, and in the end, I'm the person it matters most to.
Okay, I want to thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to do the presentation. And I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. I'll also put my contact information in the chat if you prefer to contact me that way. Thank you.